Only seconds from detonation. The grenade rattled on the wooden table, its safety pin nearly snapping loose before the eyes of 100 SEALs. The room froze, no one fast enough to react. But then a weathered hand, trembling yet precise, caught it at the very last instant. Not an officer, not even a man on duty. Just the old custodian who dusted the armory, a man everyone had long forgotten by name. That single moment didn't just save the entire unit, it cracked open a truth buried for half a century. Could a nameless keeper of the armory alter the destiny of a SEAL captain? The iron hinges groaned open in the damp dawn, revealing the shadowed hollow of the Fort Carson armory. The air inside was thick, a blend of cold metal and old gunpowder dust, hanging like a second fog. When the base was still asleep, the first figure to cross the threshold wasn't a duty officer, nor a sergeant on inventory check. It was a lean, weathered man in a faded jacket. Frank Mercer arrived at 5 o'clock, as always. He didn't need an alarm clock. His body still moved by the cadence of a soldier's schedule, etched into him half a century ago. In one hand, he carried a battered ledger, its spine worn, pages yellowed with time. His leather gloves were frayed, stitches coming apart, as though they had walked with him through many lives. Under the buzz of a flickering fluorescent bulb, rows of steel racks loomed, each stacked with ammunition crates, stenciled letters fading, numbers rubbed thin. To the young, they were just lifeless boxes. To Frank, they were memory vaults ready to detonate if handled wrong. He spoke to no one. He didn't need to. His only task was to walk the aisles, tally the numbers, check the seals. Yet he did it differently. Every stray round, every tilted casing, he would cradle in his hand, examining it as if it carried a secret. The tremor of age in his fingers vanished the moment they touched metal, becoming precise, steady, almost reverent. Once, a young private passing by had snickered, "Old man thinks he's running a museum." The words echoed off the steel walls, coming back sharper, meaner. Frank heard, but didn't answer. He simply turned the round in his palm, set it carefully back where it belonged, and stooped to pick up another. Strangely, none of his tallies were ever wrong. Where even officers made mistakes, Frank's reports were flawless. If a seal wasn't closed tight, he corrected it silently. If a bullet rolled loose to the floor, he placed it back without a word. Some whispered he was like an invisible thread binding men to their weapons, a thread most had long since let go after leaving the battlefield. Each morning, Frank walked the racks as if they were headstones. No hurry, no chatter, just the steady beat of boots on concrete. He paused before a crate of rifle rounds, his hand resting on its lid like a gesture of remembrance. His pale eyes weren't looking at steel, but threw it back to a place only he still carried. Sometimes, when the first rays of sunlight cut through the iron slats and glinted off the scarred tabletop, Frank allowed himself a faint smile. Thin, fleeting, edged with reluctant humor. Perhaps he remembered the night his platoon had argued over who would pull armory duty, only to laugh when they realized cleaning weapons was what kept them alive. Now only he remained, armed with nothing but a blunt pencil scratching numbers on paper. To the young, Frank was nothing but an old man with an old book, but to himself, every number written was a vow. That was why he never rushed, never cut corners, never left without checking one last time. That slow, steady rhythm mocked by some was his way of listening for landmines underfoot. Slow meant survival. When the morning bugle echoed across the base, boots thundered on the concrete outside, voices barked orders. But inside, Frank moved quietly, untouched by the world beyond the steel walls. A world where precision meant life or death. And that was why, when the moment of real danger came, the invisible old man turned out to be the only one who knew exactly what to do. But what in his past had bound him so fiercely to each round of ammunition, turning a routine duty into a ritual of survival? The sudden metallic clack of a jammed bolt echoed in Frank's memory, so sharp it made him flinch in the empty ammunition depot. Just a steel case dropping on the floor, but that sound dragged him back to a morning in 1969, a morning he wished had never existed. Back then, Frank was 29, commanding a Marine platoon at an outpost near Hue. The central Vietnam monsoon soaked through his fatigues, heavy as lead. In the mist streaked with gun smoke, the unit was pinned down, surrounded by enemy forces. Gunfire thundered, M16 rounds slicing the air. Frank's heart pounded, but his mind clung to discipline. Every move, every order had to be exact. Then it happened. The M60, the platoon's beating heart of firepower, jammed. The young gunner fumbled, sweat and blood running together on his brow. Frank rushed forward, but only in time to see the terror widen in his comrade's eyes. One wrong motion, one missed latch, and in mere seconds 4 men went down before him, cut apart by the bullets that weapon should have held back. Frank survived, but survival didn't mean freedom. He carried with him the still bodies, the eyes left open. Every time he heard the click of metal, it became the muffled sob of his platoon. From that day on, one truth hardened in him: every bullet bore the price of a human life. After the war, he never told anyone that detail. Not his wife, not the buddies at the beer hall, not even the government-appointed psychiatrists. He stayed silent. People saw him smile, but that smile was only paint over rust. At night, memory kept tapping inside his skull, relentless as the Hue rains falling through a season. In his worn Colorado apartment, Frank kept a medal in a wooden drawer. Silver turned yellow, ribbon frayed. He never hung it on the wall, never showed it off to neighbors. To him, it wasn't glory, it was a scar forged in metal. Each night before sleep, he opened the drawer, stared at it for a few seconds, then closed it again. Not a ritual of pride, but a reminder. Today's silence was the price of yesterday's loss. Sometimes, when asked why he checked each round with such obsessive care, Frank only gave a thin smile. Once, to a half-teasing remark from a young soldier, he answered simply, "Because I once lost an entire platoon to a single missed latch." The soldier fell silent, forcing a stiff laugh before walking away. But others who overheard looked at Frank differently after that. Still distant, still doubtful, but now they sensed his meticulousness wasn't old man habit. It was discipline etched in blood. One time, an ammo officer stumbled upon Frank sitting quietly during break, hand resting on an ammo crate, eyes far away. The man joked, "Praying to that box of steel, huh?" Frank didn't answer, he only nodded. Anyone who truly understood would know it wasn't a joke. To Frank, every crate was a tomb without a headstone, a place to honor the faces he left behind in the Hue rain. Through the long days at Fort Carson, memory never released him. It lived in the way he gripped each crate like a comrade's hand. It hid in eyes trained to blood, now tracking numbers in a ledger. It rang in every metallic click, warning him that a single mistake was enough to let history repeat. But what would happen when that obsession collided with the pride of a young Navy SEAL captain, one who had never accepted that old scars might save his life? And now, dear audience, take a moment to hit subscribe before we continue with the heart of this story, but only if you truly feel what I've shared here. Leave a comment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's amazing to see people from all over the world joining us. The clang of steel rang out as crates of fresh ammunition were unloaded from the military truck into the depot. The acrid smell of oil and hot metal drifted down the hallways. Young soldiers bustled, carrying the heavy boxes, sweat soaking through their collars. At the far end of the shelves, Frank Mercer stood with his inventory ledger in hand, moving slowly but steadily, his eyes scanning as if the smallest detail could become a catastrophe. Amid the commotion, a commanding voice cut through, firm, powerful, Captain Ethan Rourke. He was young, broad-shouldered, his stride carrying the confidence of someone who had never stumbled. His record was stacked with triumphs, his leadership of the SEALs in training drills nothing short of legendary, turning him into an idol for many of the younger men. But that same spotlight also fed a pride that was hard to control. Frank hadn't intended to interrupt, but when he noticed two soldiers stacking M67 grenades flush against each other on a wooden shelf, he stopped. His weathered hand lifted, voice low and steady. "Don't stack the grenades so close. A chain reaction, just one pin slips, the whole row will." He never finished. Ethan's voice sliced through his words like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Stick to your dusting, old man. Safety is my responsibility." For a few seconds, the air froze. A couple of chuckles rose from the younger soldiers in the back, soft but sharp enough to cut into the heavy silence. Eyes turned toward Frank, some shaking their heads, some smirking. To them, he was just an old supply man, the one the whole base half-jokingly called the gun duster. Frank didn't react. He simply lowered his gaze, adjusted the ledger in his hand, and walked on as though no words had been spoken. But his eyes darkened for an instant, fixed on the grenades lined up like sleeping beasts. He knew, one small mistake, and the entire depot could turn into a firestorm. The memory of 1969 stabbed through him again, reminding him that lives could vanish over a single missed piece of metal. Rourke strode past, his dismissive glance brushing Frank like a gust of cold wind against stone. To him, Frank was nothing more than a dusty relic of the base. Nothing worth notice. In the captain's mind, old war stories didn't matter, especially not from a man he believed no longer had a place in the ranks. But the story didn't end there. In the days that followed, Frank still arrived on time, still logged every number, still tightened every loose seal. He never defended himself, never argued. Rourke, however, grew more agitated each time he saw the old man nearby. That silence seemed like an unspoken challenge, a mirror reflecting his own arrogance back at him. Now and then, the young soldiers would joke among themselves. "Bet the old guy thinks he's still in the war." Laughter spread quickly, but when Frank's gaze passed over them, the sound faltered. There was something in his eyes, something they couldn't name, but instinct warned them it wasn't the look of an ordinary old man. One afternoon, when the depot was quiet, Frank stopped by the stacked grenades once more. He placed a hand on the rough painted surface, shook his head gently. No one saw the faint smile that crossed his face, a smile tinged with self-mockery, with bitterness, as if he already knew he would witness worse to come. The silent standoff between the weathered veteran and the proud young SEAL captain thickened with each day, like kindling smoldering beneath ash. All it needed was a spark, and the spark was closer than anyone realized. When youthful confidence collides with experience carved in blood, who will be the one forced to bow before the truth? The sharp beep-beep of a backing military truck cut through the sweltering morning at Fort Carson, shattering the heavy air. The armory doors swung open, soldiers rushing to haul in the weighty wooden crates, boots slapping against cement still damp with dawn. The air thickened with the stench of oil, gunpowder, and sweat, stinging like a storm waiting to break. Frank was already there, standing off to the side, clutching the inventory ledger tight against his chest. His weary eyes tracked every movement from a strap pulled too loose to a lid left slightly ajar. He spotted it immediately. One crate of rifle rounds improperly sealed. His feet almost carried him forward, but Frank slowed. He knew well that in this room, even a misplaced glance could be branded as insubordination. Ethan Rourke arrived just then, tall, polished, his voice firing off orders with rapid authority. The young soldiers straightened at once, admiration flickering in their eyes. The SEAL captain moved like a young general on parade, each step sure, a half-smile of unshaken confidence fixed on his face. When he caught sight of Frank edging closer, Ethan raised a hand to stop him. "I've got this." The words were short but sharp, slicing the air like a blade. Ethan bent down, leather gloves still shining new as he gripped the crate. He meant to prove his absolute control that no old armory custodian could presume to instruct a SEAL captain. Frank held his ground, eyes locked on the small gap in the lid. Sweat dampened his back, but it wasn't the heat. A tightening in his chest told him what was coming, like the echo of that fateful clack in Hugh years ago. Ethan tilted the crate. A faint bump, harmless at first glance, but an M67 grenade, misplaced inside, rolled out, half a turn across the wooden table. And then, click. The sound was dry, crisp, and chilling. The safety pin shivered as though death had just tapped at the door. The entire armory froze. Voices stopped, footsteps ceased. Only that small metallic ring remained, stretching in everyone's mind like the ticking of a countdown clock. 1 second. 2. The whole room dangled on the thinnest thread of fate. Frank's vision darkened. His body reacted on pure instinct. No time to argue, no room for pride. He started forward, then stopped at the exact moment. Ethan still had a hand on the crate, his eyes flashing confusion for an instant before pride snapped it shut, jaw clenched tight. The young soldiers nearby had gone pale, not daring to move. The air felt stripped of oxygen, the room waiting for a single spark to ignite. Frank's hand crushed the ledger until the pages bent, every fiber in him screaming to step in, to do what should have been done at the start. But Rourke, wrapped in his own ego, was still determined to prove he controlled it all. Time slowed. A bead of sweat slid from a soldier's temple and hit the floor with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. The whole room was suspended, waiting for the choice of two men, an old armory custodian and a proud young SEAL captain. One wrong move, one slip of a finger, and the room filled with hundreds of bullets and grenades could erupt into hell in an instant. Frank drew in a deep breath. His eyes never left the grenade, its pin trembling on the table. And in that moment, the past roared back, the blast splitting the sky over Hue, the rain of bullets across the mud, 4 men falling to a single safety lapse. His heart hammered, but his steps began to move slow, deliberate, unshakable. Would he make it in time? Or would history repeat itself here, in the heart of America, inside the very base where he was known only as the gun duster? The sharp click still hung in the air, thick with the stench of gunpowder. The entire armory felt compressed, no one daring even to breathe. The young soldier's eyes bulged, bloodshot, as if a single blink might trigger catastrophe. In that frozen moment, when all stood like wooden statues, only one figure moved. Frank stepped forward, not rushing, not frantic, but as if an ancient instinct had been awakened. He was no longer young enough to charge like a raw recruit, yet it was that very slowness that made his movement terrifyingly precise. His veined hand shot out, gripping Rourke's wrist, just as the captain wavered between saving face and saving lives. A single, clean twist. The younger man's arm was redirected, stripped of its chance to make another mistake. Frank's fingers clamped down on the grenade pin, locking it back into safety. The metallic rattle faded, like a beast bound before it could sink its teeth. No cheers followed, no applause, only a terrible silence. Everyone still reeled from the disaster they had just been pulled back from. Ethan Rourke staggered, his face burning crimson, eyes flashing with fury tangled with humiliation. In front of the entire unit, he had been saved by an old armory custodian, and in many eyes, his pride had just been broken. Frank said nothing. He carefully set the grenade back into the crate, tightened the strap, then withdrew his hand, as if it were merely routine. Simple gestures, yet the entire room seemed to hear a message loud and clear. There are things books can't teach, reflexes only carved by blood and memory. A young soldier nearby swallowed hard. He had never seen anything so tense and yet so calm. It wasn't the violence of battle, but the certainty of an old wolf who had tasted enough blood to know exactly when to bare his fangs. Rourke forced himself upright, struggling to reclaim his authority. But the silence betrayed him. The eyes around him no longer held pure obedience. They flickered with something else, some with respect, others with doubt. Who would the young soldiers remember more, the arrogant captain who nearly caused disaster, or the nameless old man who stopped it with a single twist of the wrist? Frank turned and walked away, silent as when he had entered. The ledger was still clutched in his hand, its pages warped by sweat. Before leaving, his gaze brushed across Rourke one last time, not with scorn, not with anger. Only the look of someone who had witnessed too much death to waste breath on words. In that moment, everyone present understood they had just learned a lesson found in no SEAL manual: humility before experience, and the worth of silence in the face of danger. Some soldiers later recalled they couldn't remember Frank's exact expression that day. They remembered only his trembling but unyielding hands, and the way that fateful click went quiet under his grip. To them, that image spoke louder than any lecture, clearer than any command. In the dim corner of the armory, a fluorescent bulb flickered, then went dark. The heavy air lifted, voices returned but softer than usual, as though afraid to disturb the memory of what had just happened. Frank kept walking, leaving behind a unit still shaken. He didn't know that this moment would etch itself into hundreds of minds, soon spilling beyond the cold walls of the armory, spreading farther than any order ever could. All right then, my dear audience, if you're still here and find this story gripping, drop a comment with the number 1 or simply say, "I'm still here to keep listening." The deadly click had stopped in the armory, but its echo refused to stay buried within the cold cement walls. A security camera fixed to the ceiling had caught the entire moment, from the instant the grenade trembled to the old hand reaching out, twisting the SEAL captain's wrist and locking the pin back into place. The footage was plain, unpolished, just raw truth. Only hours later, the video surfaced on the base's internal system. At first, it replayed endlessly in the young soldiers' lounge, a strange mix of tension and awe. Quiet curses slipped out, heads shook in disbelief. Some rewound again and again to the exact second the old hand gripped the pin, their eyes wide as if learning a lesson never written in any training manual. But what appears on a closed network rarely stays there. No one claimed responsibility, yet with a single click, the footage leaked. Within 24 hours, Reddit was ablaze. Veteran groups on Facebook exploded and YouTube filled with slow-motion replays frame by frame. Comments flooded in like a tidal wave. He didn't strike first, but he didn't let a mistake kill anyone. Not every metal shines. Some sit buried in the dust of an armory. An old wolf still remembers how to survive. Respect. Short sentences, yet their impact spread louder than any official report. And then, old stories about Ethan began to surface like wrecks rising from water. A sergeant recalled being punished to stand in the rain for 2 hours just for stepping out of formation. A lieutenant recounted being threatened with transfer for refusing to sign a false report. Complaints once buried now resurfaced, chained to the image of the arrogant captain who nearly triggered disaster. Meanwhile, Frank, the man who had stood silent after the incident, uttered not a word. He still came to the depot, still scribbled in his old ledger, still tightened every seal as though nothing outside had changed. But his silence only fanned the flames. To the veteran community, Frank became a new symbol, living proof that experience and integrity could shatter hollow glory. An internal military paper ran a small but cutting headline: "The armory custodian has wiped the stain clean." The image spread alongside a hand-drawn sketch. An old man bent over a crate, hands gripping a grenade pin. Behind him, the shadow of a young captain collapsing. No name, no explanation. Everyone understood. In Idaho, an 83-year-old veteran sent a handwritten letter to the base, shaky but resolute. "We remember him. We left him alone for too long." At a small tattoo shop in Texas, a former SEAL inked a jagged line across his arm with the words, "Silence is also a fight." Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted, little by little. Young soldiers began to greet Frank in the hall, not loudly, but unmistakably. The mess cook slipped an extra donut onto his tray, brushing it off with had leftovers. An officer passing the armory gave a faint nod, though he'd never acknowledge it out loud. Ethan, however, was different. Every step he took now carried added weight. The eyes of the men under him no longer held only obedience. There was doubt, hesitation, even pity. For a man who had thrived on power and admiration, that was the heaviest blow of all. And everyone knew this wouldn't end within the armory's four walls. Once the veteran community rose, command would be forced to listen. Old investigation files were being dragged out from dusty cabinets, now glowing bright under the spotlight of public scrutiny. Now that truth had escaped the cold walls of the depot and spread across the country, could Frank remain silent, or would he be pulled into the heart of a storm far greater than he ever imagined? Morning at Fort Carson was draped in a pale gray, the sky heavy with low clouds, as if the entire base itself was holding its breath. On the bulletin board by the mess hall entrance, someone had pinned a printout from the viral video, the image of an old hand gripping a grenade pin, Frank's calm gaze facing chaos. Beneath it, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Not every metal shines." Frank walked past, holding his worn cap in one hand. He looked at the paper for a few seconds, then lowered his head, not in pride, not in shame, but like a quiet nod to the souls still marching with him. The duty soldier, seeing this, suddenly stood at attention. No orders, no reason. Others, too, fell silent as he passed, a respect no one commanded, but which spread naturally. In the command room, officers sat around a long table, reports and files stacked high. Ethan Rourke's name appeared again and again in old complaints pulled from dusty drawers. Under pressure from the veteran community and the military press, the internal investigation could no longer be delayed. News spread across the states, from a small cafe in Texas to a nursing home in Florida, where men who once wore uniforms now sat in wheelchairs, their hearts stirring as one of their own rose by standing still. Ethan was reassigned in silence. No farewell, no goodbyes. Just a military truck rolling out the gate under the harsh noon sun, leaving heavy stares behind. For him, silence was no longer power, it was a sentence. Frank was different. He still came to the depot at 5 a.m., still recorded numbers in his battered ledger. But now, each step he took echoed louder than ever. People spoke of him not through numbers or medals, but through a single moment, a hand clutching a grenade pin, and eyes that did not waver. In the mess hall, the young soldiers quieted when he sat down. Some still laughed, but the edge of mockery had dulled. A sergeant slipped an extra sugar packet into his coffee, joking, "Sweeten up the bitter life." For once, Frank smiled a true smile, rare as it was. Sometimes respect begins with something small. Outside, the world was still ablaze. Hundreds of letters poured into the base, some postmarked from as far as Alaska, others from cities whose people had never set foot in Fort Carson. The words differed, but the meaning was the same. "We see you. Don't think your silence means nothing." Frank read a few, tucked most away. He wasn't chasing praise. For him, silence was the reward. Yet deep down, he knew one truth. Honor never rusts. It only waits for a moment to be seen. One afternoon, as sunlight cut across the Rockies, Frank's shadow stretched long on the concrete path to the depot. He paused to straighten a broom propped against the wall, a small, ordinary gesture no one ever noticed. But this time, from afar, a group of young soldiers watched and stood straighter. eyes following him. They didn't cheer, didn't clap. They simply observed and learned that leadership sometimes comes from the smallest acts, without orders, without rank. Frank stepped into the depot, his shadow swallowed by the green glow of fluorescent lights. And behind him, a question grew across the base, seeping into conversations and training journals alike. Was this the end of an old soldier, or the beginning of a legend a whole generation would have to relearn? At Fort Carson, they still saw Frank walking the lit hallways, with his faded cap and battered ledger. He offered no explanations, no defenses. Because now, each of his steps was proof that some values never rust, no matter how many layers of time and neglect try to bury them. The story of the armory custodian did not end with the moment he held a grenade pin in place. It spread as a reminder. Silence can sometimes be stronger than any order. It taught that honor does not come from rank, but from character tested in decisive moments. And most of all, sometimes when one person stands firm at the right time, an entire unit can be saved. Ethan Rourke may have left the base, but his shadow still lingered. Unanswered questions hung heavy. Would he recognize his mistake? Would arrogance turn into a lesson or return in a more dangerous form? And Frank, the man who chose silence, could he remain on the sidelines forever? Or would he be drawn into another confrontation, greater than before, when honor is no longer just a matter inside the base, but of the entire community? My dear audience, perhaps you, too, have met armory custodians in your own life. Those quiet, unassuming people who say little, yet when danger strikes, they are the ones who step forward. Frank Mercer's story reminds us that true strength is not found in youth, glory, or rank. Real strength lies in the ability to hold on to integrity, even when the whole world turns its back. If you feel this story touched your heart, share it with your family and friends across America. Let these silent acts be spread, remembered. And don't forget to leave a comment below. What do you think of Frank's silence? Would you like to see Part 2, to discover what happens when he is forced to face even greater powers? Because sometimes, the next chapter is not just Frank's story, it is the story of all of us. They had stopped sending signals. The SEAL team was trapped between the cliffs of Black Canyon. No reinforcements, no escape route, not a single UAV in the sky. Not because of any ban, but because no one dared to fly into the place that had nearly swallowed the entire squad last time. The same mountain crevice, the same trap. But this time there was no plan B. No safety waiting behind. Only silence. Until the ground trembled with a deep, harsh sound, slicing rapidly across the mountain slopes. It was not the sound of rescue. It was a roar of vengeance, tearing through the void like thunder across a shredded sky. A SEAL whispered, as if afraid his own voice would shatter the impossible. No, she's back. And all the survivors looked up, because they knew, every time that roar echoed, a legend stepped out of the shadows. The rumors about her never disappeared. They weren't recorded in military reports, nor did they appear on any official files. They lived in the neon-lit bars, in grocery stores smelling of weak coffee, and in the knowing nods exchanged among veterans who were far more accustomed to other people's failures than to examining their own. Her name was Sarah Miller. In Buena Vista, Colorado, that name once stood for pride. The only A-10 pilot in the squadron, someone who flew so close that her wheels nearly brushed the treetops. But one day, it became a warning sign. The press labeled her the disgrace of the Air Force. Over time, the story became legend in that small community. A dive gone wrong, a half-second delayed signal, and nearly the entire squadron wiped out over the skies of Afghanistan. She was grounded. No hearings, no defenses. Just a single order folded neatly into a white envelope. Now, every morning, Sarah drove a faded green delivery truck, dropping off supplies at the local supermarket. No uniform, no medals. Only a worn baseball cap bearing a faded A10 logo remained. The hat reminded people of her, and then they immediately looked away. The community still honored veterans, erecting memorials in the Central Park, flying flags on porches. But for Sarah, they offered the gaze of an outsider. In bars, sometimes someone would half-jokingly say, "The pilot who almost sent the whole squadron to the hereafter." A hoarse laugh would echo briefly, then vanish as she walked past. Sarah didn't argue, didn't justify herself. At night, neighbors heard the whirring from the garage. Not the television, not the radio. It was the plastic propeller of a remote-controlled model plane. A child's toy, people thought. But for Sarah, it was the only way her hands could remember the feel of flying. In the darkness, her eyes tracked the tiny model looping in circles, as if trying to hold on to something lost forever. She lived like a shadow. Only one detail betrayed that silence: the faded tattoo on her right arm, the words, "No one left behind," embracing the A10 insignia. A vow never retracted, even though everyone else had withdrawn their faith in her. The paradox was this: the townspeople believed in loyalty, believed in sacrifice, yet they so easily forgot a pilot who once flew to save them. Sarah became living proof of a truth nobody wanted to admit. Sometimes society doesn't want the truth, it just wants a name to blame. The small town continued its daily rhythms. People still strolled along the Arkansas River, still photographed the snow-capped mountains in the distance. But in a dark corner on the town's edge, one woman waited quietly. Not for forgiveness, but for the single moment that would prove all those whispers wrong. The question is, when that moment comes, will anyone still dare to face the truth head-on? People often say, if a secret is important enough, it will find a way to reveal itself. For Sarah, that happened on a seemingly meaningless morning. The small delivery truck rocked along the dusty road leading to the repair shop, where the smell of oil and burning metal lingered in the air. Sarah was all too familiar with this rhythm, delivering a few boxes of parts, signing a couple of papers, giving a quick nod, and disappearing before anyone could stare too long. The town had framed her into the role of a delivery woman. She had let that frame confine her until the thread on her old jacket pocket tore. A small piece of metal fell onto the concrete floor, producing a dry, sharp clink that sounded unusually loud among the machinery. Sarah bent down to pick it up, but another hand was faster. It was a young soldier, his face still carrying the innocence of 20 years, wearing an oil-stained t-shirt, eyes shining as if he had just seen a treasure. In his hand was a worn challenge coin, engraved with the emblem of the 303rd Fighter Squadron, the Hog Drivers. That symbol was unmistakable, the A10 Warthog, wings like blades, representing a spirit fearless and unyielding. The young soldier's eyes lit up with excitement. To him, it wasn't a chipped coin, it was proof of a legend. Sarah froze for a moment. Part of her wanted to smile faintly at his naivete. Another part felt her heart tremble. She snatched the coin back. The motion was quick and decisive, like an old reflex that hadn't faded. The coin disappeared into her pocket, leaving a brief silence between them. But the soldier had already seen it. Not just the symbol, but her trembling hand holding it, trembling not from fear, but from memories rushing back. The shell Sarah had built over many years, a silent woman, just a shadow of her past cracked in that instant. Since being grounded, Sarah had lived by small routines. She controlled them as meticulously as a pilot checks the cockpit before takeoff. At exactly 5 a.m., black coffee. At 6 a.m., start the truck. At 9 p.m., a small model airplane looping above the empty lot behind the garage. Not a single beat could falter, because any gap, no matter how small, would unleash the flood of memories. Yet that young soldier had just created such a gap. In his eyes, Sarah glimpsed what she had lost. absolute faith that flying meant freedom, meant power, meant never leaving a teammate behind. And painfully, she had once embodied that faith. News of the 303rd had spread across the base. The Hog drivers flew so low that soldiers on the ground could see the pilot's eyes in the cockpit. They were respected for one reason: never abandoning anyone on the battlefield. Even when flying over valleys where radars were blind, where a cheap RPG could turn a warthog into a pile of scrap, Sarah had carried that belief on her back. A belief so big it became a burden. One dive gone wrong, a single second's delay in formation, and reverence turned into condemnation. She had lived with that condemnation for years, burying it in silence. But that coin, seemingly just a piece of worn metal, tore that silence apart. Ironically, while the town saw her as a failure, that young soldier saw something in her she had forgotten, proof that legends aren't made by chance. They're forged with sweat, blood, and scars no one wants to mention. And in that moment, Sarah realized something. Some memories never truly vanish. They lie in wait, like the faded warthog sitting under the eaves of some base, gathering dust but far from dead. That night, back home, Sarah spent hours staring at the coin. Her rough fingers traced its scratched surface as if trying to touch the cockpit she once knew. Under the pale yellow light, her face revealed a thin smile, half bitter, half proud, a smile the town had long forgotten. She knew her shell had just cracked, and once a crack appears, what's hidden inside will find a way to escape. When everything is exposed, will she fall again, or will this be the moment she soars back? Can you guess what happens next? Relax for a moment, comment, 1, or I'm still here, to keep following along. Accidents never knock before they enter. They usually arrive unexpectedly, as if choosing the exact moment when someone lets their guard down. A week after the brush with her past, fate came for Sarah, though she had no idea. In western Colorado, the joint exercise between the SEALs and the Air Force was supposed to be a familiar scenario: a transport helicopter carrying elite soldiers, simulating an ambush, then finding a way to retreat. A war game, nothing more. But that game twisted within a few short seconds. The simulated air defense system, which was only supposed to fire lasers to mark targets, suddenly malfunctioned. A real warhead launched, tearing through the air. It didn't need long to find the hovering helicopter trapped in the Black Canyon Gorge. A crisp explosion echoed, like a full stop marking the end. The helicopter shuddered violently, black smoke erupting like a flag of death. The pilot struggled to maintain control, finally forced into an emergency landing on the jagged rock below. Inside, the SEAL team tumbled like puppets jerked by violent strings, bones colliding with steel, blood spreading across the floor. No one died instantly, but with each passing minute, their chance of survival narrowed. They sent distress signals. The radio waves slammed into the sheer canyon walls, then faded. Only a few weak fragments escaped, drifting through the chaotic air layers. In the command room at Peterson Air Force Base, officers strained at the blinking screens, interrupted signals like whispers from ghosts. A young commander sighed, his voice heavy. No aircraft can get into that gorge. No one. It wasn't just a technical truth, it was a verdict. Black Canyon was notorious for its treacherous terrain, vertical cliffs like razor blades, unpredictable whirlwinds, and a space so narrow that even the most seasoned pilots called it the Stone Tomb. Satellites couldn't penetrate, radars were useless. Entering meant signing your own obituary. In the silence, a raspy voice broke through. An older officer, decades of flying etched into his eyes, cloudy yet still sharp with the cold clarity of one who had witnessed too many accidents. He looked at no one, just muttered, "There was someone who once did it." The room held its breath. Young officers turned to listen. The old man slowly lifted his head. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed like stone. Sarah Collins. That name had long vanished from official records, existing only as a shadow in stories told at the base bar. A pilot who had once flown a battered A-10 Warthog through terrain everyone deemed impossible. A pilot who had pulled 12 SEALs from the jaws of death, and the only pilot ever grounded after surviving because the price of audacity was a casualty list the higher-ups never wanted mentioned. In the minds of those who had witnessed it, Sarah was an uncomfortable secret, both a source of pride and a shameful wound. People didn't know whether to remember her as a hero or as a reckless risk-bringer. But now, with the SEAL team trapped at the bottom of Black Canyon, no one cared about labels. They knew only one thing: there was no other choice. Ironically, at the very moment her name was spoken, Sarah was on her routine delivery run. She even thought today was quieter than usual. Empty streets, coffee not too bitter, and the old playlist in her truck repeating a song she had heard thousands of times. Had she known that, at the same time a room full of officers was silently debating whether to call her name, she might have laughed a laugh both sarcastic and bitter. They needed her only when everything had fallen into chaos. But fate never asks permission. It knocks, and usually with a fist. Debate erupted in the command room. Some objected strongly. Sarah was grounded, not authorized. Others smirked, saying invoking her name was like clinging to an old legend. Yet amid the objections, the real question emerged. If not her, then who? Maps spread across the table, flight paths drawn and immediately crossed out. Every option led to dead ends. Only one memory remained, a memory of a woman who had done the impossible on a night of smoke and fire. The base colonel, known for his cold demeanor, finally closed the file. He spoke little, but his eyes delivered the decision: find her. And so, after years of silence, the sky called out for Sarah Collins once more. She had no idea, but fate had begun to move, like the blades of a plane slowly starting before roaring to full power. Some news drifts past ears and disappears like the wind. But there are other pieces of news which, once they reach the right person, turn into an irresistible call. For Sarah, it wasn't a cold administrative notice from the base, but a scattered fragment of information, spreading through the town like fire over dry grass. A SEAL team was trapped in Black Canyon, and no pilot dared to fly in for a rescue. Others heard it and shook their heads, calling it a distant tragedy. Sarah silently left the table, drove straight to the abandoned hangar on the outskirts. There, under a thick layer of dust, like a blanket of time, lay a steel beast that once roared across the skies of Afghanistan. A 10, serial number 81-0973. No one thought it still worked. Some even joked it was only good for scrap metal. But Sarah knew better than anyone. This beast was not easy to kill. She walked slowly along the fuselage, fingers tracing the cold metal, where scratches and dents spread like scars. Amid them, a small etched mark remained, a line left by her former squad mates. For those on the ground, to outsiders it was just a motto. To Sarah, it was a guiding principle, the only reason she had ever risked everything. Because on the ground, the soldiers waiting were not numbers on a report, they were flesh and blood teammates. She stood there for a long while, as if listening to the past whisper through the dust. Eyes that had once hardened to smoke and fire now shone, both resilient and fragile. Perhaps after all, she had never truly left the sky. She had merely buried her wings under the weight of ordinary life, waiting for fate to knock again. Night fell, and the town was silent. People assumed Sarah had returned to her worn apartment with only bookshelves and a flickering night lamp. But before dawn, the radars at Peterson AFB began blinking. A signal took off from the direction of the abandoned hangar. Not a modern F-16, nor a transport helicopter. Instead, On the screen appeared a name many technicians thought had been erased from the system. A-10C Thunderbolt 2, Serial 81-0973. The news spread like lightning through the command room. Chairs clattered, footsteps echoed. Officers rushed to the screens, unable to believe their eyes. Someone exclaimed, "Oh my God, it can still fly?" Then the commanding voice thundered, "Who authorized takeoff?" The answer came over the radio, hoarse, brief, impossible to interrupt. "Don't ask, they need me." No authentication code, no rigid protocol, just a familiar voice, carrying the weight of memory. In that moment, no officer doubted who was on the line. In the misty sky, the old A-10 screeched like a steel beast waking from a long slumber. The TF-34 engines roared, trailing thick gray smoke, yet still powerful enough to shake the window panes of nearby houses. Sarah sat in the cramped cockpit, everything at once alien and familiar. The old control panel, a few loose switches, dim screens, yet her hands moved instinctively. No thought required. Her body had been trained for this moment years ago. A moment of humor, if one could call it that, came as Sarah had to slam the electronic panel 3 times before the HUD screen lit. "Good thing I still know how to calm your stubborn self," she muttered, almost smiling. The aircraft seemed to respond with a deep, resonant scream. Back at the base, many officers were still arguing. Some demanded the A-10 return immediately. Others insisted the pilot had violated military orders. But amid the noise, one truth was undeniable. Out there, a SEAL team was still trapped. Time was not on their side, and only one aircraft was heading toward Black Canyon. Sarah knew the price she might pay. Failure would mean disappearing forever, not just from the sky, but from collective memory. But if she succeeded, perhaps for the first time in years, she could stand tall without feeling the past crush her shoulders. The steel beast shook violently as it raced toward the horizon, and somewhere in the old cockpit, Sarah whispered words no one could hear. "This time I will not leave them behind." Dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part. It's going to leave you in awe. Take a moment to leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always thrilling to see people joining us from all over the world. In the dense darkness of Black Canyon, no sound remained except for labored breathing and bullets ricocheting off the cliff walls. The SEAL team clung to the tiniest crevices on the mountainside, evading fire from malfunctioning simulated anti-aircraft guns while trying to keep their radios alive amid the weak signals. They were accustomed to no one arriving in time, accustomed to the cold finality of a lost connection. But accustomed did not mean ready to face the outcome. Then, suddenly, a deep roar echoed through the canyon. Unlike the familiar sounds of helicopters or modern fighters, it was a metallic, wild sound, the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger gun firing. Bullets rained down like shooting stars, tearing the ground apart, shredding the mock artillery emplacements into chaotic flames. The canyon walls reflected the roar, making it reverberate like endless thunder, shaking the hearts of those who heard it. The SEALs looked up. In the brief moment when fire and dust erupted, they saw the silvered, chipped paint of an A-10 streaking through the canyon. Its wings almost scraped the cliffs, sending small shards of rock hitting the ailerons and leaving bright white scratches. Yet the beast did not falter. It banked sharply, tilted, then roared again, firing as if ripping the entire sky apart. One SEAL gripped the radio, voice choking, almost crying. Amid the chaotic noise, a few words rang out clearly. She's really here. Ironheart is back." In the cramped cockpit, Sarah gripped the controls. Sweat seeped into her gloves, the HUD flickered on and off, but her eyes did not waver. She knew this aircraft was no longer perfect, knew every violent shake could be the last. But if she had to choose between falling and abandoning her teammates, she hesitated not a second. The A-10 was never built to be beautiful, but to endure. And in Sarah's hands, it did more than endure. It came alive. Tight loops, dives skimming the rock that many modern pilots would never dare, all became familiar rhythms. For a rare moment, Sarah almost laughed. When the plane shook violently after taking a hit, the pressure gauges spinning wildly, she muttered under her breath, "Don't sulk on me right now, old friend." And as if in reply, the engine roared louder than before, pushing the A-10 out of the hail of bullets. A strange, darkly humorous moment, but sometimes only those who have stared death in the face could understand it. On the ground, one simulated artillery emplacement after another was obliterated. Sarah wasn't aiming for perfection in each burst. She was aiming for one thing only, opening a corridor of life for the incoming rescue helicopter. Each exploding emplacement illuminated the air enough for the SEALs to know they were not being abandoned. But Black Canyon did not surrender easily. Another series of rounds hit the left wing, shaking the A-10 violently, spewing thick black smoke. Radar signals at Peterson AFB flickered chaotically. Many officers panicked, thinking the beast was about to fall. But in that canyon, Sarah had no right to let it crash. She yanked the stick hard, using her own battered fuselage to shield the helicopter daringly advancing into the canyon. The armor steel designed to protect the pilot now became a shield for an entire team on the ground. Once, twice, and on the third hit, the A-10 took more damage. Yet it still flew. How it did so remained a mystery. To the soldiers below, it was no longer metal and ammunition but a steel spirit, refusing to retreat until everyone was safe. Finally, the rescue helicopter touched down, wheels hitting the ground sharply. The battered but alive SEALs scrambled aboard. Above, the A-10 still patrolled, like a loyal hunting dog, ready to swallow any remaining danger. Only when the helicopter lifted off, leaving the canyon, did Sarah ease the controls slightly. Yet even then, the roar of the A-10's engines echoed like a warning to Black Canyon, "Don't touch them while I'm still here." Smoke trailed behind the plane, blending with the Colorado sky. To outsiders, it was the sign of a machine in its death throes, but to those who witnessed it that day, it was the mark of a legend rewritten. Sarah and the steel beast had carved a bloody path through Black Canyon, but how long could a smoking, battered A-10 continue to fly before fate came to collect its debt? The moment the helicopter blades touched the safe sky, the radio suddenly went silent. No guidance, no pounding heartbeat of the female pilot's voice. Only the wind howling through the canyon and the fading echo of the A-10's engines like a soul departing from a tragic stage. The SEALs looked at one another inside the helicopter. Each knew that someone had chosen to stay behind just to make sure they could go on. That night, Peterson Base descended into chaos. Officers scanned for emergency signals. Radars swept across the mountain ranges, but there was no trace of 81-0973. Young soldiers in the operations room tried to reassure one another that she would return. Yet as dawn broke over the horizon, the cold truth remained. Sarah had vanished, along with that silver beast. But what was lost was more than a pilot and an aircraft. What remained was a story, and that story wasted no time finding its way into the hearts of all America. The next day, newspapers from Colorado to New York reported an unnamed A-10 pilot had risked her life to save an entire SEAL team in Black Canyon. From the forgotten archives, the image of the aged Thunderbolt II suddenly appeared everywhere on television, front pages, and in every conversation at roadside diners. It was called The Miracle in the Canyon. Within hours, America seemed to reclaim a lost memory. Articles didn't just recount the battle, they traced the past of a woman once cast aside for an old mistake. Sarah, A name once paired with failure was now etched as Ironheart. No longer a symbol of defeat, but proof of an eternal vow for those on the ground. On veteran forums, those who had served with the A 10 years ago returned, sharing tales of old planes saving them in distant valleys, dusty deserts. They said the A-10 never abandoned the troops on the ground. And now, all of America had seen once again that legends need not be polished, only loyal. In Buena Vista, a small cafe, usually crowded only on weekend mornings, a server watched in surprise as an elderly man placed an object on the counter. A worn military coin, etched with the insignia of a long-defunct unit. The veteran pushed it toward the young woman, whispering as if someone might overhear, "Return this to her, and tell her America owes her a bow." No one saw him leave. Only the heavy coin remained, cold as steel, yet carrying the weight of a nation reclaiming a piece of collective memory. In the following days, the story of Sarah did not stop at the newspaper. It became a topic in military classrooms, family dinners, even late-night talk shows, where a host jokingly called the A-10 the cranky grandmother of the Air Force, old, temperamental, yet not to be underestimated. Audiences laughed, then fell silent, remembering that someone had truly flown that ancient beast to become a living shield. And somewhere, amid the chatter, a question still lingered. Was Sarah alive, or had she remained in Black Canyon? A nation had looked at Sarah with new eyes. But would Sarah herself ever see that day, or would her name exist only in the stories retold? Thank you for joining us. Perhaps, like me, you sometimes wonder, do those who fight silently for others ever get recognized? Yet the most beautiful thing is, they don't need recognition. They don't need to be seen to shine. They only need a reason to keep going. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see someone joining us from around the world. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this story, so we can continue bringing you more incredible tales.